We're going to give you more than 50 reasons why 2000 was the greatest year ever in hip hop. Don't believe us? Count them.
I think hip hop will always be a voice for the people.
Hey everybody, I'm Reggie Williams, founder and CEO of Ambrosia for Heads, and with me I have Jake Payne, our editor-in-chief. And together, this is our What's the Headline podcast. We got a very exciting week for you lined up. If those of you who tuned in before, we did a special edition back in, I think, December of 2020 about 1984. It was the first in a series where we look at many years in hip hop and a quest to determine which year is the best year ever in hip hop. Truth is, there's several that can fit the bill. I think a lot of people get caught up and say that it's in the 90s. Jake and I have both been fans and students of hip hop, and I've had a philosophy for a long time. I'm not going to speak about you. You can weigh in on this in a second.
Yeah.
But I've always said that the golden age of hip hop is from 1978 to the present. I don't believe there's any one year, although there's some strong years. I don't think there's any one year that you can declare the absolute best, but we're going to make an argument for a really, really interesting year right now. I'll also share that Jake and I have disagreed quite often about a lot of things when it comes to hip hop, which is what makes us great partners because we're yin and yang, very complementary. Often we'll like the same albums, but completely different songs on it. And so this is a year, 1984 was a year that I put forth because of, so many things that I saw as being kind of landmark things that happened during that year. This year is one that Jake put forth. And it took some convincing. It took some convincing behind the scenes. I was like, nah, man, that's weak. Like, we need blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And Jake was like, okay, all right, I got something for you. And he went behind, worked his magic as he always did. And behind the scenes, I should say, and worked his magic, and came up with a really, really, really compelling set of reasons for why this year is one of the best years ever in hip hop. And I'll let you do the honors, Jake. What's the year?
Y2K, year 2000, man.
Y2K. All right, so this is your show, man. You kick it off.
I think it's interesting, because I know there's, you weren't quite 16 years old in 1984. I mean, you were around that age, and I was around that age.
You got to stop dating me, man. This is second time you try to shape
Nah, man.
I'm ageless, I'm ageless.
Yeah, that's very true. I wish that I was, but no. I mean, it's interesting. 2000 was a year that was very important to me. It was probably, I'd have to look, but right around that time was when I first started writing about hip hop purposefully. Like high school newspaper status, and definitely was check the mailbox, the first of the month type of person, with The Source and Double XL and Stress and so on and so forth. But when you really step back, I think 2000 is one of those years that people don't talk about nearly enough. And when you lay out the facts, it is a contender for one of hip hop's best years, and to us, and to the sake of this conversation, there's technology at play. There's a lot of interesting things, but look no further than the music. And just to start us off on a high altitude, why don't we talk about the classic albums that came out in 2000?
So classic albums in 2000, there were quite a few, and it wasn't until you listed them out on the document that I was like, oh man, 2000 was really, really on point in terms of bodies of work. And as you know, I'm a big fan of albums that are cohesive and that have several tracks. Classics are unskippable. There aren't that many classics, but a great album has to have, I would say, I don't know, call it 70% great tracks. One of the ones that I can think of was actually the end. Well, I won't say the end, but I think it was toward the tail end of a 4-album run, unlike any artist not named Kendrick Lamar. And I mean 4 straight. I don't mean just 4 in the catalog. I mean 4 straight. and that was with OutKast. You know, OutKast stood on that Source Award stage, was it 1995, and said,
Yeah.
you know, the South got something to say because they won a Source Award and they were getting booed and you know, just like Death Row, who's getting like, you know, hammered in New York, they said, look, y'all gonna have to respect us, and they went out and proved it. So they kicked things off with Southern Playlist of Cadillac Music. Then came Atlians and ATLians, and then came Aquemini, which is my personal favorite. You know, but then right after it was Stankonia, and that was the year 2000. So that was by my count, they were 4 for 4. And on Stankonia, you got Gasoline Dreams, you know, which is fantastic. That's that introduced Killer Mike, right?
On that album, but
Snapping
not
and
that
Trapping,
song.
right? Snapping and Trapping, yeah. So Gasoline Dreams, So Fresh and So Clean, Miss Jackson, which, you know, aside from that double album, I think is probably their biggest single. Spaghetti Junction is a sleeper on there. The first single was B.O.B. Bombs Over Baghdad, which had that like Planet Rock beat to it, you know, it's real like electro funk kind of tempo. It had Humble Mumble featuring Erykah Badu, you know, one of my favorite artists. Just a really incredible album. And, you know, that's just one of many, but I know you got a couple favorites too.
Yeah, I mean, that album again
what
is...
say about that album?
Yeah, I mean, that album was the first time I had a really interesting advanced copy of something. So that lets me know right there I was writing. And I think I had it, you know, 2 or 3 weeks before the album dropped, and it dropped right around Halloween. And I look at Bombs Over Baghdad. I mean, to me, Stankonia has the perfect singles. And I totally agree with what you said. I would never dispute that OutKast doesn't have 4 straight classic albums. But Bombs Over Baghdad, you know, you look at the way these two guys are rhyming in a syncopated style over that drum pattern. I mean, to me, you want to be like, you know, B-Boy Bravado and talk about your Cool Keiths and your Lakim Shabazz and your great MCs of the like 88, 90, that run. This is just as good. And the fact that that song was all over, you know, radio and video. Yes, this was OutKast, but you were, you know, advanced hip hop on a higher level in everybody's face. And Miss Jackson, I mean, you know, we look today at what, you know, so many artists are doing with the melody stuff. I mean, none bigger than Drake. OutKast, like Nate Dogg, like Pharaoh, like Devin, is a great example of artists, you know, Heavy D, that was doing that at a really high level then. And it's funny, in the year 2000, there were 2 songs that were big pop hits that I loved the first time I heard them. And by the time a year later, they were played out. One was Maria Maria, you know, on the, you know, Santana album. And the other was Miss Jackson. And there's been just enough time, you know, 21 years later almost, where that song has died down enough where I can enjoy it again. But that album is great. And you know, for anybody that watched the you know, the Flavor Unit you know, documentary on Organized Noise, you know, I know those guys were frustrated as OutKast, you know, and Mr. DJ continued to produce more of their own albums, Mr. DJ being their DJ, and together they were Earth Tone 3. But, you know, they still kept Organized Noise in the mix. Some of those songs you just mentioned were them. And you used the word earlier, cohesive. The fact that you have 2 different production entities coming together, both happening to be trios, and making this end-to-end burner, man, that album is insane. And you said Aquemini is your favorite. Every one of those 4 albums, I can go at a different time and say that's my favorite. But today, you know, of those 4, Stankonia is it, just because the way that they got that kind of, you know, that funkadelic, that psychedelic sound with the guitars in there. Man, that's just a special kind of hip hop that was super duper inventive.
Yeah, you know, the other thing about that album, and actually a lot of OutKast music, is that it ages really, really well.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of hip hop sounds dated. It's locked into a specific time period. But that album, especially like Bombs Over Baghdad, you put that on now, man, and like you could start a riot. It's just crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it gave B.O.B. the rapper singer his name, I mean, in part. And that album, yeah, just incredible. And even a joint like Toilet Tisha, which, could be like the pick and boogers of the 2000s. I played that song today before this conversation, and it still goes. And I went from being in my teens, I'll age myself, to now being in my mid to upper 30s. I can still listen to it. It's aged with me.
So you put another album on here that I don't know has aged as well, and I was surprised that you put it on there. And you might even know by the setup, but that was Country Grammar by Nelly. You wanna break that down? Why you
Yeah. I can, and this is I talk on this podcast sometimes about being objective. For me, I was not the biggest fan of Nelly on the scene. Like that, and I'll give him his flowers. Like Nelly knew how to make the catchiest, most, melodic but still rap stuff. And I'll step outside myself because there's other albums that I would consider classics this year that we're going to talk about that I don't play every year. Country Grammar is one of them, but it went diamond, and that's a huge accomplishment in hip hop. I don't think, I know Hammer's on there, but I don't think you can say any of the diamond certified albums are whack. And to this day, if I'm listening to Rock the Bells or I'm listening to Mix Show at Lunch and EI comes on, I play that. I enjoy that. Country Grammar, the title track, I do. And, these songs are forever embedded in our lexicon, whether we like them or not. And, I look at Nelly and I look at Ja Rule, and they very much served a purpose. And I feel like if you take them out of the equation, hip hop today doesn't quite sound the same. These guys made catchy songs that kind of towed the line between rap and R&B, and they really found an incredible ear for beats. And Country Grammar has that. And Nelly came into the game from St. Louis, not a city that had huge recognition in hip hop. He came in the game with, a really unknown team around him, and he made it work on the highest level. And that was a time that I distinctly remember turning on Rap City and seeing artists that I had never heard of before, had not gotten off of features or major cosigns. They weren't signed up under somebody else. And I think Nelly is a shining example of that. And I know 16-year-old Jake right now is throwing, stale produce at me for saying it, but give the man his propers.
Yeah, I can't go as far as saying that I would consider that album a classic.
Uh-huh.
What I can say though is that, like you said, it was diamond, and it had two of the biggest singles, not only of the year, but two of the bigger ones in hip hop. Country Grammar was one, and then EI was another one. And Nelly, kind of single-handedly put St. Louis on the map.
Yeah.
And really just like put on for his city and changed the sound of hip hop in a lot of ways. Which leads into another album that we're going to talk about, but we didn't put on the list, but I think does squarely belong in it. There's a guy who said, only dudes moving units is M, Pimp Juice, and Us.
Yeah.
And that was Jay-Z, and so he released his album, The Dynasty. And, would you call, first of all, I've always thought of that as a compilation album, as like, it's kind of like a Roc-A-Fella compilation album instead of a solo album. You call it a solo album or a compilation?
I think it's a solo album. I hated that compilation. It kind of felt like when somebody's playing chess and they keep their hand on the piece just to see how you're going to react. I feel like Dr. Dre did that with the Aftermath album. I feel like there's great artists in hip hop that have put out something and then kind of been able to use it as a get out of jail free card with their discography. And, at the time, I didn't get the feeling that that's what Jay did with that album. I think our takeaway as fans was that because 2000 was a year that Bleak got his second album, and his first, in my opinion, kind of went unnoticed. By his second, Bleak was more in your face, but it was also the year of Beans, coming out with his own album. And first time I heard Freeway, 1-900 Hustler. So Jay used that strategically to bring people with him, which I think you see a lot of other places in hip hop. I'm not going to call it a compilation. I think it's a Jay-Z album, and I think it's a damn good one.
Well, so I wouldn't put it in his top five.
No.
I would say Reasonable Doubt, Blueprint 1, 444, Black Album, and Volume 2 probably in that order for me.
Okay.
But I might put this album at number 6 when I go back and revisit the track list. So, you know, key joints on it for me: Change the Game, I Just Want to Love You, which, you know, we'll get into it, but, you know, introduce, like, really put Pharrell and the Neptunes on the map. Streets is Talking, Just Blaze, and just murdered that with Beanie Sigel. This Can't Be Life, Stick to the Script, you know, Holla. That was a one for me that was like probably a sleeper, but like Holla, 1-900 Hustler.
That's my joint.
I mean, there are joints on this album, like real joints. And so while I wouldn't call it a classic necessarily, I would definitely put it in there with some of the strongest in Jay's catalog, which means it's some of the strongest in hip hop.
I like this album more than Volume 3. And on a personal level, I prefer it.
I said Volume 2 though.
You did, and that's what I was getting to. On a personal level, I prefer it to Volume 2. Volume 2, I went back recently and I enjoyed it, but it was always the album in Jay's catalog that I always felt was a little bit overrated, and the album that I feel is underrated is American Gangster. But yeah, I mean, people don't talk about Rock La Familia, and what's so interesting about it is Jay gets all this credit for what he did in 2001 with, you know, the blueprint and showing vulnerability. You mentioned This Can't Be Life. Like, that song, I truly believe you could yank off of this album and put on that one. There's a few of those moments. And 1-900 Hustler, oh man, like, that was a period of time, you know, you just mentioned the Neptunes, where Just Blaze went from being this guy that I had read about in either Blaze, XXL, or The Source, who was making beats on a two-way, to the way that he was flipping rock and soul samples and letting the song cry. Oh man, like that joint. And as a hip hop fan, 1-900 Hustler is a remake of a song by the Convicts on Rap-A-Lot, you know, which is Big Mike before he joined the Ghetto Boys. Like, no one talks about that. Like, it is an update a decade later of this joint of like, don't play with my phone. Here's a lot of game. I'm going to give it, you know, and when it's all said and done, I'm ready for Freeway's album. Like, here, boom, take my $16. And you know what Bleak does and what Beans does on that song is just epic. To me, that is one of those Roc-A-Fella posse cuts that is possibly number one, definitely in my top 3.
Word, I love that joint. It gets me hyped to this day. So we talked about Pimp Juice, Jay.
Yeah.
That leaves M. M had what I believe was his only classic album. You want to break that one down?
Yeah, I mean, the Marshall Mathers LP, just an insane record. And that was, you know, I lived through All Eyes on Me, you know, the double album. I lived through certainly Life After Death and, you know, Wu-Tang Forever. But this is an album that I remember that was, everybody was skipping school to run out and buy it. You know, people, it was a conversation piece and everybody had it. And you look at the takeaway, and I do agree with you. I think it's a classic album. The part about M's only, like, I'm not upset at you with that. And it's funny because in recent years, I think you're a far bigger Eminem fan than I am. But this album is damn near close to perfection. And, you know, I know it's the big played out song after I just said that about Miss Jackson. But I think Stan is a worthy place to begin, and just talking about what makes this record great. You know, taking the Dido song, flipping it, you know, shout out to 45 King and Kid Capri, and coming out with something. I hadn't heard Dido when I heard Stan. And then to have those songs living in coexistence together, the video with Devin Sawa, you know, became like a mini movie. And 21 years later, we're still using that word in our lexicon. Stan will live forever. Even as Eminem's favor, you know, fluctuates, you and I will accuse each other of being stans of different artists all the time. I just think that is Eminem at his best. And then what I really liked is, you know, you take a joint like Remember Me with RBX, who had made a very, very similar song on Dre's Aftermath compilation. Never thought I'd bring that up twice. And you had Sticky Fingers on there. And like M with the Bass Brothers, with Dre and Melman, just had this vision of an album that feels like a concert. And to me, you know, you talk about Stankonia, you talk about this. I feel like year 2000 album making was just on a really, really high level. And whereas in the 90s, Pac, Big, Bone Thugs, 8 Ball and MJG, they'd throw, you know, they would just do a double disc and charge fans $25. I feel like there was a little bit more revision processing and a little bit more A&Ring by year 2000. And that shows itself on this album.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about Stan. I love, the 45 King story.
Yeah.
He's an unsung producer. He's known for, the 45 King, song, but he's truly he was a producer who just does not get that same kind of credit as others. And then flipping Dido, that Dido sample, which was not an old song. It had been released, I think, within a year or two of that album. And it's very rare for an artist to flip a song that was popular and make it that much bigger. So I really love that. I think it was M at his most diverse. The Slim Shady character wasn't as prominent on Marshall Mathers LP. It was a much more introspective album, darker beats, and I think that's what appealed to me. It wasn't as poppy as some of the other stuff had been, and I think that's what really drew me to the album.
They used, the real Slim Shady to kind of kick open the door in the album. And I think I've heard it said, but to me, it just reads like a Jimmy Iovine move of like, yo, let's get Middle America in the door. Let's get the TRL crowd. Let's take a bunch of shots at Carson Daly and Britney Spears again, which M had done on the Slim Shady LP. And to me, that's the weakest song on the album. And it's the one song that you will not catch me in my car listening to. People love The Way That I Am. I mean, that song was an anthem to so many people. And you look in M, I mean, long before Instagram and people posting lyrics of tattoos, I feel like this album, between that and Criminal, it had that. And I feel like, to Dre's credit and Aftermath, and I'll give Jimmy and Interscope the credit too, they let Eminem go completely off the rails on this one and just be as problematic, as dark, as say what the F he wants. And that might be why this is his best album, because after this one, there was even much more at stake. I think this is the one all day long.
Yeah, Be Pleased, was another one. Yeah, so great album. So moving on to kind of the opposite end of the spectrum is Like Water for Chocolate by Common. That to me that's probably my favorite Common album. It is the Soulquarians at their peak. And, Soulquarians being the collective of, Questlove, D'Angelo, Erykah Badu, is Bilal in there too? Dilla's in there.
There's so many people in it, the Pino Palladinos and the Bob Powers and like when you really look at the Soulquarians, it's bigger than even I think we realize. But yeah, I mean the whole roots, James Poyser, Roy Hargrove Jr., RIP, like there was a tribe.
Yeah, it's crazy. And so on that album, you've got Time Traveling, which is just like a fuzzed out, like psychedelic, almost throwback to the 70s. It's more like a soul funk joint than a rap. You've got Doing It, which is one of my favorite Dilla beats ever. You've got Sixth Sense. You've got and this was rare too. Is Thelonious was on both that and Fantastic Volume 2. Like I don't know which one like actually can claim ownership, but that song was phenomenal. There's so many great songs on that album.
You got The Light. I mean, one of the great hip hop love songs.
How can I forget The Light? Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. So that to me is it's my favorite Common album. I would call that one a classic. I can't think of much that I would skip on that album.
No.
What was your take on that one?
No, absolutely. I mean, I love this album. I go back and forth between this and B. And this one, I mean, it's over an hour long, whereas B is more like Illmatic length. And Common, his first album, you know, has a host of people, including the Beat Nuts and whatnot. And then he goes into 2 albums with no ID. And then he came out of that, and this sounds totally different. And whereas the Roots kind of progressed with, you know, Soulquarians, Erykah Badu, we watched that happen really at the onset of her career. Common is the artist that I think completely transforms through what was going on in Electric Ladyland Studios. I mean, this album doesn't sound at all like what came before it. And, you know, Dilla absolutely shined. I mean, one of the things that I think is emblematic of year 2000 is Jay Dilla, Pharrell, a few producers' impact on hip hop. And yeah, I mean, this one just works. And I'm gonna say, and I know I might not be able to live in Philly anymore, but this is my favorite hip hop album from the Soulquarians movement. And you know, it stands up. Just like Stankonia, this album hasn't aged a bit. Even the humor after The Sixth Sense, which is one of my all-time favorite songs, where Common makes fun of himself. I mean, he has a woman come up to him that's like, you know, oh brother Calm, you know, you're so good to the women, and meanwhile he's literally pimping on the corner. And I like that Calm, you know, took these steps but didn't take himself quite so seriously. And just a phenomenal record.
Yeah, and you know, Pop's rap, you know, he had a series of Pop's of songs where his dad appeared. Rest in peace to him also. But I think this one, Pop's Raps 3, was probably my favorite in the series. So, you know, just all around strong offering. So, you know, as melodic as that album was, on the opposite end of the spectrum of that was
You ready for it?
Ghostface Killah. Ghost. Okay. Well, no, we can go with this. Even more so is M.O.P.
M.O.P. Warriors. So
Warriors.
I'm on here, and folks may hear, you know, me or us say what is said about Nelly. I contend that the album from 2000 that is a classic with 2 C's is M.O.P.'s Warriors. And, you know, again, one of the things that we're going to see a lot of in year 2000 are a few labels really doing their best work. And Loud Records just killed it. I mean, they had already, you know, made classic albums with Mobb Deep and Wu-Tang and Alcoholics, so on and so forth. But here they took, you know, Billy and Fame, who had made good stuff with Relativity, some great singles, but some really good albums. And they made an album that, you know, I think is incredible. And, you know, they got DJ Premier even more involved, but they also kept it in-house. I mean, this is the album that spawned Annie Up. And again, I mean, it was just so refreshing for me coming off of the late 90s Shiny Suit era, which produced great music, but I felt like the underground wasn't getting its recognition, to watching Annie Up on Rap City every single day, hearing it on radio where I grew up in Pittsburgh. And that's a joint that M.O.P. produced themselves, you know, well, with DR Period, excuse me, but somebody that they had been working with. And I love that. I love that factor. That album is everything that those guys had been doing themselves, just A&R'd a little bit better, just turned up in the right way. And there's songs on that album like, you know, Face Off 2K, which, I mean, I've had conversations over the years with DJ Premier where he's like, that is one of my favorite joints that I've ever done. Switches the beat halfway through the song, you know, creates a beat just for Fame, creates a beat just for Dan's. Those guys leave nothing unsaid. You know, Roll Call. There's just so many joints on this album, and I encourage anyone to listen to it and tell me why I'm wrong, because I don't think you can.
Yeah, Cold as Ice was another one.
It's
You know,
huge.
using that Foreigner sample, like, you know, M.O.P. and Foreigner, you know, it's crazy. But
Yeah.
and you know, even the remix, you know, and a lot of times I don't like when artists use the same song twice, because I feel like it's cheating. But you know, adding Buster to it, and you know, they just took it up to a whole different level. So
Early Remy Ma too, you
yeah,
know.
early Remy, yeah. I mean, so yeah, you know, I don't know that I can say it's a classic, but it's an incredible album, and
Yeah.
definitely stands with M.O.P.'s best. Um, you know, going back to the Soulquarians, I'm gonna tick off two real quick. So this was their year for sure. Common, like you said, kind of embodied their best hip hop. I think their best soul came in the form of both Erykah Badu's Mama's Gun and Voodoo. You know,
Yeah.
Mama's Gun is probably one of my top 3 albums of all time, period, any genre, any artist. There's probably not a week that goes by that I don't listen to a song on that album. And that's going on 21 years now. That album like makes me emotional. And I'm still learning new things. I found out I can't even remember the song of the day that I sent you a week or two ago, but that
Johnny
um
Hammond.
yeah, oh right, Johnny Hammond Smith.
Yeah.
I think it was the Times of Wasting.
Yeah.
You know, that's a no, Smile, yeah, Smile, yeah, is a sample. But that album, it starts off with a kind of a filtered track vocal, penitentiary philosophy, just like Common starts off filtered with time travel, and I hadn't made that connection before. But real dirty and real like aggressive, like soul funk. Dilla has got and on, which is kind of like a part 2 of On and On.
Yeah.
Toward the end of the album, you got songs like 3000 and Times of Wasting, Orange Moon, and then you've got Green Eyes, which is, if not Erykah's best song, one of her best. You've got Clever. I mean, that album is just front to back, does not stop. And so the second one, Voodoo by D'Angelo. So I had such huge expectations because Brown Sugar was one of my favorite albums. D'Angelo quickly kind of came into that like family of, James Brown to Prince to then D'Angelo for me, and
Yeah.
some Pac is in that lineage now too, for me. But Voodoo was a radical departure from the first album. The first album was smooth and soulful. You had songs like All Right, you had songs like Me and Those Dreaming Eyes of Mine, you had Cruising, you had Lady. It was a real soulful like groove,
Retro.
Voodoo, yeah, Voodoo was very dissonant, like it was unlike anything you'd ever heard before. Player. He's also got a filtered voice, like starting off on Player too. That so that they definitely had that theme going on those first songs on those Soulquarian albums back in 2000. And then it gets into Devil's Pie. So what's interesting about Devil's Pie for me is I actually did the production agreement for DJ Premier producing D'Angelo. And I was so excited when I saw the file. And obviously I saw the file a year and a half before the song was released. But then when I heard the song, I was like, not really. It's not really, I don't really check for it. And Primo is probably top 3 producers for me. D'Angelo's probably top 5 artists. So it's still to this day, it doesn't really like grab me, but like songs like Left and Right, with Red and Meth, who just made that appearance on Versus, Chicken Grease, Funky, Feel Like Making Love, Untitled, Spanish Joint, Africa. There's just so many songs on this album, just front to back for me. It just is nonstop.
They definitely gonna hate on you more for underplaying Devil's Pie than they are for me, shooting Nelly some bell. What's so interesting too is, on premiere joint, 6 Cents, incredible. One premiere joint on D'Angelo, which is wild, and many people know by now, but Cannabis passed on that beat, and Premier was so upset that he was like, I'm going to give it to somebody else like tonight. And, I'm paraphrasing, but he went over to the studio and voila. And what was really cool is I think 3 years ago, you and I sat front row for a live taping of Questlove Supreme, and Amir was interviewing Common, and they were talking a lot about, these albums. And what was so interesting, and you and I were both bugging out as fans, they talked about, I think it was Spanish Joint in trade for, was it Doing It? That they work these.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Because and Quest has affirmed this numerous times on his pod, but like they didn't know where these songs were going to end up. So the fact that you have this kind of just, manufacturing plant, and that takes all the art out of it, to the way I'm describing it, but they're making incredible things, not knowing where they end up, and out of it. I mean, we're only talking about year 2000. forget Things Fall Apart, forget, but there's so many other incredible joints, and these albums are so cohesive, and these songs ended up like baseball cards, just kind of where they land. It's just incredible to me.
Yeah, I mean, another cool experience you and I had was interviewing DJ Premier about that picture with him, D'Angelo, Alchemist, and who was the fourth? You remember the fourth? Was there a fourth, or was it just three?
Dilla.
And Dilla, right?
Yeah.
And that was during those sessions. Was it for Voodoo? I can't. I mean, for was it
Yeah,
for, I can't
I,
remember.
I feel like it was that night. It was definitely shot at Electric Ladyland, not D&D. And that was another thing too, is Premiere. And I mean, Gangstar was like, we don't go to you, you come to us. Like,
Yeah.
you're going to 37th Street. And I think, D'Angelo and the rest of those guys, like, we kind of got our own thing going on down here, which is just epic, hip hop folklore.
Yeah. So, part of the reason why I think Devil's Pie is it's a really, it's not as melodic, it's a very discordant kind of beat. And that's why it always takes a while for me to get into RZA beats too, because it's very amelodic, kind of goes like, against melody to some degree intentionally. And so, but one of Wu's greatest albums was released that year too. You want to break that one down?
Yeah, and the cat's out of the bag. Supreme Clientele, and here we are, just having talked recently about Raekwon versus Ghostface Killah, incredible. But Ghost, I look at Wu, and I definitely, and I say this because 9 MCs, and shout out to Capadonna for 10, I hold them all in high regard. But I think that many fans would agree with me that there tended to be a sophomore slump of some kind. And a lot of that, I think, was fan induced. We talk about Raekwon coming off of the Purple tape and, going in a little bit of a different direction, and fans not necessarily riding with him. And that's happened with Snoop, that's happened with Nas, that's happened throughout hip hop. GZA, I don't really count. Words from the Genius was pre Wu-Tang, and Liquid Swords is incredible. But in the post 93 era, not everyone was able to deliver boom, 1-2 punch of classics. I think the closest up until this point was Method Man. I mean, the 98 to Cal 2000 Judgment Day topped the pop charts. Incredible record for Def Jam. It yielded some hits, but I don't know that it quite scratched the itch for the fan base. Then you get to 2000, and Ghost had made Iron Man in 96. And I think this is a case of the sequel being better than the first. There's a lot of people that debate that very subject. To me, this is the best Ghostface album. He definitely, had a weapon in his corner with RZA, providing production past the first album, which not every, I wish Deck and Master Killer and You God got that. But what Ghost does with that, I mean, is absolutely incredible. You get Nutmeg, you get Mighty Healthy, which is a mathematics beat. And, I said on this pod, I think that that's my favorite solo Wu song, that's on an artist's album. There is, Incarcerated Scarfaces and Criminology are right there. But Mighty Healthy is absolutely incredible. You've got One, produced by the Beatnuts. So while Ghost was staying close to RZA, he was also evolving in a way that he didn't with that. And to me, this album is just sort of like what I said with M. It was like, at the Razor Sharp label, which was RZA's short-lived joint at Epic, they just let Ghost do him. And this album is raw, it's lyrical, it's what was the word you used?
Dissonant.
Yeah, dissonant.
Discordant. Yeah.
It's dusty, but then at the same time you have a joint like Cherchez Le Ghost, which Ghost is seeing what Wyclef and Puff and a lot of the mainstream rappers are doing. Oh, I'll take a disco joint and I'll Ghostface Killah it. And I just love that. I mean, to me, this is an album, again, that I can just put in, lean back. I skip nothing on here. And it's why we're talking about it, 21 years later.
Yeah, I would say it's just probably my favorite Ghost album too. I don't disagree with you there. So we got one last one that we both would put kind of in that classic category. That's Reflection Eternal, Train of Thought. Talib Kweli and High Tech. I think what's really interesting about the album is that, you know, a lot of people probably got their first taste of Talib Kweli with Mos Def and Black Star, and
Yeah.
probably thought the two of them were a group. And so this was Kweli, I think, showing the world that he stood on his own 10 toes as an MC and could hold down an entire project, no problem. And although it's a collab with the producer, so he's definitely the featured MC. For me, songs on this that I love and still go back to are Move Something, Memories Live. That sample is just so soulful and like mournful. Uh, Good Morning is another one that I go to
Yeah.
all the time. And then, the classic that I think kind of defines him is The Blast.
Yeah.
And that one, remixes, like but that one is so incredible. But, what spoke to you about the album?
Love this album. I mean, I often say it's a neck and neck battle with me between this and Black on Both Sides. And not to say that you have to compare the two, but I say that more to sing Kweli and High Tech's praises. I love Down for the Count just on some spherical bravado lyrical shit, and this was a breakthrough year for both Rod Digga and Exhibit as well. So to have those three MCs on a song together is very symbolic of the year. I love Soul Rebels too. I mean, Black Star was right at the cusp of being part of the Native Tongues movement. Mos was very much, messing around with, De La on Stakes is High and Bush Babies and stuff. But to me, that, as somebody who was 16 at the time, let me know that all is not lost. I really, 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 appreciate that. You mentioned Memories Lives, and then Africa Dream, which is, it's featuring Weldon Irvine, who had mentored, Q-Tip and a bunch of other people. Madlib dedicated a whole album to him. And it starts as kind of like a Last Poets, drum pattern record. And Kweli drops some of the best bars of his career, talking about like slaves on a ship, talking about who's got the flyest chain. And that was just such an indictment of the label stuff that was going on. You had the Hot Boys in the video showing chains and all of that, and it was just very much speaking from that underground place. And Ruckus, I think year 2000 was really interesting for them. For this album, they put out Lyricist Lounge 2 and kind of upheld that tradition. And then they put out Big L's album, and Ruckus was changing. Company Flow had left, not so happily, and L had started Def Jux. But you look at this album, and people didn't know what to call it. You look at the artwork, and it's Talib Kweli and High Tech, and In the Know fans called it Reflection Eternal. But Ruckus had not spent much more than a single or two over the years marketing that group, and it just was an exciting time where you could go to the record store, see some familiarity, trust enough to buy it, and then go home with the classic album. And this is one that I play all the time, and I really, really, really think that High Tech is undersung as a producer. Within a couple years of this, he would kind of come up under Sha Money XL and start getting some bigger placements through representation. But the High Tech that we get on this album, that we got on Definition with Black Star, just truly one of the best producers, and came with a sound unlike anybody else. For as much as we can talk about Dilla and Alchemist and Just Blaze and Kanye starting to emerge in 2000, give Tony all of his props.
Absolutely. All right, so there's no doubt that great music came out of 2000, but one of the things that you and I debated about behind the scenes and coming up with this was that I don't think that good music is enough to call a year great or definitive. Every year you can pull out probably 4 or 5 classic albums, many times more. And so for me, there have to be things that happen that kind of change the direction of hip hop, either change the direction or have lasting impact or definitive moments in like a person's career. So let's talk about some of those. We talked about Eminem's album, Marshall Mathers LP. For me, though, this was what solidified the fact that Eminem was not just a novelty. Obviously he had his album, was it Infinite or
Yeah, in '96. Yeah.
before before Some Shady LP. But Some Shady LP is when he was on most people's radar. And to me, the album was very gimmicky. Slim Shady was a gimmick. Um, he was over the top with his themes. He was like a shock rapper. I saw it as something that could be a one and done very easily. But this album brought him back and established him as a true artist and positioned him to ultimately become the biggest artist of the decade in any genre. So to me, this was the one that made Eminem for real and made him Marshall Mathers, not just Slim Shady. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And very quickly, with this album, Eminem had a seat at the table at a very interesting time for Dr. Dre. I mean, we'll eventually talk about the Up and Smoke tour, but Dre was creating a symbolic reunion with Ice Cube and MC Ren, and Yella, producing again with Snoop. Dre kind of had a coming home after 2 or 3 really rough years before 1999 and his 2001 album, and M was part of that, and Exhibit later. And yeah, I mean, absolutely, Eminem took the easy pass express lane to the top of the class, and he definitely had earned hardcore hip-hop respect on the first album. Some of those moments, stuff that he had done with Ruckus, Scam, the lyrics, all of those incredible features that Eminem made in the late 90s. But this album showed that he was here to stay, and that even though when he had all the attention and money on the line, he was still going to do what made sense for M. And I feel that, he did that through the years that followed, the next few years. But this was that at the best, because I think so many times we're used to an artist getting that kind of fanfare and then going full out, Hammer, Vanilla Ice, Tone Loc, whatever.
Okay, so Eminem plants his flag and signals that he's about to become the artist of the decade. At the
Yeah.
same time, we talked about these guys. There's another artist that had a coda that showed that they were arguably the best rap artist of the prior decade, and they ended that run, I think, in 2000, and that was OutKast.
Yeah.
Because even though Speaker Box of Love Below would go on and win the Grammy for Album of the Year, still to date the only real hip hop album that's done that. I don't think that most OutKast fans would call it their best album or even put it above any of those 4 albums. So to me, OutKast's incredible run was concluded with Stink Honey.
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree with that. And, to have a 4-album run, you and I just spoke recently on this show about Benny the Butcher and what he's done in the last 2 or 3 years. And Benny's done it, but he's not done it on OutKast level. And I think even Benny would agree with that. So OutKast, to do that 4 albums, make the statement, was incredible. One artist that we haven't talked about that I'd like to throw in the mix is LL Cool J. LL Cool J in year 2000, puts his GOAT album out. And, that term had been used before, but again, it's one of those things that pushes the lexicon, like the word stan, or so fresh and so clean. And LL, I mean, believe it or not, it was year 2000. I mean, 15 years after radio, that he gets his first #1 album. And, say what you will. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that GOAT is LL's best album. But it's dope to see that we were living in a time where a veteran like LL could do that. And I'm not going to sit here and say that I think that Def Jam bought a bunch of units. That was a good album. I mean, Ill Bomb is one of my favorite LL songs of all time, DJ Scratch production. I mean, he came and brought the bars on that. So to see him, benefit from hip hop being in the popular genre like that after 15 years is just one of those love to see it moments.
Yeah, it was the penultimate moment for LL Cool J for me. So GOAT, I doubt that he coined it, but I can't remember anyone else saying it before that, and he certainly popularized it. And that's a term that transcends music. People use it in sports terminology all the time. Like, it's almost like bling, like, how
Yeah.
pervasive that became. So for him to claim that, and after, like you said, I think a 17-year run,
Yeah.
starting from 1984. In fact, he's the guy who ties these two episodes together so far,
Yeah.
because LL's career, got the jump off in '84 and was winding down in 2000. So, I think he earned that title of GOAT, and isn't in the discussion enough. When you think about longevity, you think about consistency, you think about success, you think about impact on the culture. Like, he absolutely, has the right to say that. I think that his 2002 album, 10, was his last really good album.
Yeah.
Then after that, like, it starts to get a little bit more thin, but definitely a great year and moment for LL Cool J to kind of, like, stake his claim as being hip hop's greatest.
You
Another
see,
person,
oh, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I just riding that veteran theme for a second. You had Nas, who was A-list Nas. I mean, just had put out. I know he had put out Nostradamus in '99, and that album got a lot of pushback. But Nas, was definitely in the uppermost echelon of rap. And for him to do QB's Finest again, that is a compilation album. I'm no disputing it. And maybe that's a reflection of what that album is and how Nas, navigated it. But Nas took his platform and used it to put on, to not put on, but shine a light backwards on MC Shan, on Craig G, on Roxanne Shante, on Tragedy Gaddafi. And I thought that was really cool. And maybe at the time we didn't see it. I know we got a few singles on it. It was a big record for, folks like Big Noid and Cormega. But in retrospect, I think how cool was that, with his everything that he had, Ill Will Records and all of that, Nas did something thematic like that. I just love to see that 2000 was this intersection of all of this really interesting talent on the MC side, on the producer side, but our veterans aren't getting boxed out. And you and I talked about that a little bit with 1984 and Curtis Blow, but you see it on a much more widespread level here.
Yeah, definitely was not my favorite project of Nas's at all. But I hear you in terms of, like, the statement that he made and the fact that he was putting on his team. And so I'll go back to Jay with the Dynasty, because, whether or not we call it a compilation album, he put the Rock on his back on that album. Or I won't even say that, because those dudes, like, took the torch and ran with it.
Yeah.
But he gave dudes shine. I mean, so Beanie was on, a bunch of tracks. I mean, Bleak was on tracks. Like you said, Just Blaze kind of got his, like, that was his real coming out party. There was a lot of, like, Roc-A-Fella. That was a real group effort, even if it wasn't a compilation album on the Dynasty. So, Jay and Nas continue to stay kind of in lockstep with one another and putting on their teams.
Yeah.
That in that year. Someone else who had a year that I think was a pivot point that would reposition his career tremendously. And, for me, I don't know which decade is better for this artist, and that's Snoop Dogg. So Snoop Dogg, obviously defined by Death Row in the '90s. The first artist to debut #1, I think, on the Billboard charts. First was his debut album. Doggy
Style.
sold 700,000 copies in a week. Didn't do a million, but it was like those numbers were unheard of at that time. Obviously the soundtracks, work with Tupac, like, he had a great 3 to 4 year run, Beat a Murder Case, like the whole nine. And then, epic kind of, like, fall, split up with Death Row, falling out with Suge, down on his luck, and, teams up with Master P, who, gets him out of his contract, gives him a very equitable contract, 3-album deal, owns his own masters, like, really completely changes, Snoop's status as not only an artist, but as a business person.
Yeah.
And a culmination of that was the third album, The Last Meal. And, that album, he had reunited with Dre on Top Dog on Just Dipping, which was
Just dipping and be pleased, yeah.
and Be Pleased, yeah. And then, but he had 4 Dre songs on The Last Meal. He had production by Battle Cat, so it gone back to his guy Scott Storch, who was really starting to come up, after splitting with the Roots, and Timbaland. So that was a statement album that really showed that Snoop was an artist who wasn't dependent on any label, Death Row or No Limit, wasn't dependent on any single producer. Snoop Dogg was a superstar, and for me, the albums that would come after that, the Blue Carpet Treatment, Rhythm and Gangster, were just as good as anything he put out in the '90s. And I think it's what allowed him to become Snoop Dogg, not just a rapper,
Yeah.
but a personality with longevity who is still extremely relevant, 21 years later from that, and 31 years later from when around 31 years later from, or 30
His
years
jump
later
off.
from when he debuted in '92.
Yeah, I mean, this album was so interesting to me, and it speaks a lot of what I think artists use their platforms to today. I mean, the title meant this is the last time somebody's going to eat off of me, and Master P signed off on it, and it was the last No Limit record. It comes out. It speaks to there's songs on here that have that bounce. He's got Back Up Off Me with Magic and Mr. P on here, or Master P. He's definitely gone back with Dre. He's got Lady of Rage on here, MC Ren, who is bubbling, Cube. It appeases all of his different fan bases. And it does. It sets him up. When I think of Snoop Dogg, I think of ownership. I think of somebody who is always authentic to themselves, but where you can see him in a Pepsi commercial, you can see him, doing whatever, and no one ever calls Snoop a sellout. So this point of like, hey, you know what? I've got plans. And yes, shout out to No Limit and Master P, and I will always love those guys and speak highly of them. They helped get me out of a bad situation, but from here I go. Is really cool. And the album itself, I mean, No Limit Top Dog, I think was, of the 3 albums he made at No Limit, that one's the best. This one's number 2, and you got joints like Laylo on there that still continue to play well. And in his last days at Death Row, Snoop was working with Timbaland. People forget, but Timbaland came in and did some remixes and stuff. So to see them reunite properly on here was really cool. And again, he was throwing a line to folks that would benefit from his platform, your Cocaines, your Butch Cassidys, your Sugar Frees. And as for me, especially at the time, as a huge fan of West Coast rap and reading Murder Dog magazine, I was, kid in a candy store to see the kind of love that Snoop spread around on this, which again is something that we associate with his brand.
So Eminem, Jay-Z, and Snoop position themselves for 10, 15, 20-year runs.
Yep.
All jumping off in 2000. LL and OutKast, it's kind of their farewell parties are close to it. 2 other entities that had dominated in the '90s started to have their end in 2000. And that was No Limit and Death Row. The 2 people who put on Snoop. So you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, just kind of in short, I mean, Death Row, Suge Knight was still locked up. He would come out in the next year and change. But the label stars had left them. They were doing things like dissing everyone who had ever worked with them. There's a DVD of them releasing, Dr. Dre and Snoop's address, like their home addresses, that came out right around this time. And Daz was probably, the last of the artists that were on the label at the beginning, the last hope. And right around year 2099, he finally leaves. And in Y2K, he put out a joint called Raw, which is really like the second Daz solo album after Revenge, Get Back, and Retaliation. I think I screwed up the order. But Raw was a great album, and Daz essentially takes the album that he was going to give Death Row and puts it out, which created a whole lane in the underground. Snoop would later do that too, in terms of just making independent stuff. And meanwhile, with No Limit, it's a little bit different. Master P, is in his 30s at that point, always said he could hoop. That was his personal dream, and he went all in on that. and he went all in on the sports management thing, which, you know, I thought the BET docu-series in 2020 was really good. But as Snoop leaves, Mystical finds even more success on his own than in the 2 or 3 albums he had done with Master P. The label just kind of lost its luster. It was still P, Silk the Shocker, C Murder, and Romeo. And I feel like from a label that went from having 23 releases in 98, 15 in 99 to a paltry 5 in 2000, the writing was on the wall. And even though they, you know, helped, you know, introduce currency in the next few years, the label had really just kind of lost its cachet. So with that, you gave an opportunity, you know, certainly Roc-A-Fella was on the rise, but I think you start to see like Rough Riders diversifying. I mean, they put out 2 great DMX albums in 98, but in 2000 was the year that they got the locks off Bad Boy, put up We Are the Streets out. You know, Cash Money is in full force since 98 with, you know, Juvenile, Big Timers, BG. They're still making moves in year 2000. Ultimately, those 2 artists even go on tour together, which I think, again, speaks volumes to hip hop being ready for some new faces, some new labels, some new guard.
All right, so 2000 signaled the end of some incredible movements and the beginning of others. All right, so we got some dominant, long-lasting themes there too. So great music, dominant themes. Let's talk about. So we talked about albums. Um, let's talk about some songs. There's some songs on here that aren't on some of the albums that we mentioned. I think we covered a lot, but
Yeah.
they're worth kind of going through. You know, so one is Hip Hop, you know, by Dead Prez, and that is an anthem that you can still play today, and it's a celebration. You know, in theory, it sounds like a celebration, but it's also very questioning
Yeah.
of what's going on in hip hop. It's I don't like to use this term, but it's conscious rap that has gone, you know, mainstream and become like a club anthem, which is rare, you know. And so Dead Prez did something out of the ordinary then. You know, we talked about Slum Village a little bit, but, you know, that album, fantastic, you know, volume 2, you know, I think it could go in that classic category too, but Get This Money,
Yep.
Playlist, Climax, Raise It Up, you know, just a lot of great songs there. One of my favorites is Bumpy Knuckles, Industry Showdown. You know,
Shakedown.
Shakedown, Industry Shakedown. That album was dope and had like, you know, Pete and, you know, I think Premier and it had a bunch of like
Diamond D. Yeah.
incredible producers on it. But you know, Pete Rock with Industry Shakedown just killed that beat. And you know, and Bumpy, who, you know, most people or a lot of our listeners know was Freddie Fox, Foxx. First time I ever heard him was on KRS-One's Rough Rough. Um, Funny story, his verse is forever. It's like 30 plus bars. It's
Yeah.
crazy and it's so ill. He tells a story about like, you know, his enemy and like how he kills his enemy, then he raises his son just so he can kill his son. Like, I mean, it's just it's grimy. And the reason why it's so long is because, you know, he's sitting there in the studio with KRS-One writing his verse, and you know, he's writing, he looks over at Chris. Chris is still, you know, writing. He looks over him, you know, hour later, still writing, and finally he's like, "Yo, man, you know what's going on?" And Chris was like, "Oh man, I'm just doodling. Like my run's up here." And he didn't realize that KRS was just going to freestyle his verse, and he killed it, by the way, too. And so that was my introduction to Freddie Fox, and I always loved that dude because that verse is just so crazy to me. But then after that, he didn't do anything that really resonated, really popped. And so, and it's, you know, this is, you know, the time, you know, before, like, you know, we'll get into like, you know, digital downloads and all that other stuff. And so it was really hard to find anything of his. So when I stumbled upon this Industry Shakedown album and realized, oh, Bumpy Knuckles is Freddie Fox, it was like, it was fantastic to see a dude who I had so much respect for and loved so much reinvent himself and come back so much stronger.
Yeah, I mean, you love to see that, and this was like post MF Doom, where hip hop loved that, and Fox did the same thing. I mean, he used a lot of cartoon imagery when he did that, and went completely independent. And you know, and that's somebody I don't think I've made a lot of friends with artists. That was never my prerogative. But the first artist that I ever considered to be a friend is Bump, and he had a birthday earlier this week, so I reached out, and that joint, I mean, changed the trajectory of his career after being the feature guy with Chris and G-Rap on Money on the Bank and OC and Gangstar. You know, it's funny in retrospect, you look at this year and some of the singles, again, we didn't talk about Prodigy at all, but Keep It Thorough, I mean, which was an incredible joint and one of those songs that I just assumed Havoc produced, not because it sounded like it, but because the beat was so incredible, only to find out, whoa, who's this Alchemist dude? You know, Boom, you know, we're talking about Premier a lot, but you know, Royce was 2 years away from his album, but he was in this label system and put out Boom, which to this day is still one of his greatest songs, DJ Premier produced. You know, come on, what's bigger than Whoa by Black Rob, which is Buck Wild production, you know, from DITC. And I mean, again, that was another song that was in the lexicon of us all. I remember all around year 2000, everything was like, whoa. And Rob, who had been this guy who was deep on the benches of Bad Boy, you know, since the mid 90s and the post Craig Mack era, finally got his chance. And to this day, you and I talk about that album, Life Story. I mean, you know, but look no further than the single. And since you mentioned hip hop, I mean, that beat to me and that song is so incredible, because here you had guys that I didn't know, you know, previously to that, in M1 and Stickman, and they were saying about the killings of Tupac and Biggie what their own friends weren't, of like, yo, we're going to take action on this and we know it, let's talk about it. And I just thought that was so crazy. That beat is insane. And then, you know, in the next few years, Chappelle gave it a second life by using it as, you know, the entrance music of his show. And to this day, you know, people talk about certain records of the eras, like Ghost Stetza at the Latin Quarter, and everybody would hit the floor. To me, when I hear the beat to hip hop, like, I don't care if, you know, I'm having the best conversation of my life, I'm stopping what I'm doing and kind of, you know, getting involved with that song. I just, you know, what's better than that?
Word. All right, so we got enduring albums, we got singles that still resonate today, and you know, people go back to when they think about like classic hip hop. You know, one of the things we talked about with 1984 was that it brought the Fresh Fest, you know, the first hip hop super tour. And fast forward 16 years later to 2000, we got 3 kind of super tours. So one was Up in Smoke. You know, we talked a lot about like Dre and his impact with Eminem and Snoop. Obviously, he worked a lot with Cube. And so the Up in Smoke tour was Dre, Snoop, Cube, Eminem, West Side Connection, D12, Nate Dogg, and Dog Pound.
And more. I mean,
and more,
artists,
yeah.
like Razcast told me one time, you know, I mean, he was paying out of his own pocket. Like, artists were just trying to hook, because this was the West Renaissance, you know, it was incredible.
Yeah, and so I didn't get to see the tour, man, but I bought there was a VHS cassette, a VHS tape of the tour. So I bought that, and it had all the behind the scenes stuff and, you know, like pool parties and stuff like that. And it just was an incredible, incredible experience. But, you know, complete opposite of the spectrum for that was Spit Kicker. You want to talk about that one?
Yeah, man, Spit Kicker. So Common, De La Soul, Pharoah Monch, Bismarcky on the turntables, Reflection Eternal, and I think there were some, you know, other artists. But Me and My Crazy World, to quote the Lost Boys, July 31st, 2000. Both are in Pittsburgh the same night, if I'm not mistaken. And I was working at Burger King at the time. I'm not above sharing that on this platform. And a coworker of mine was like, yo, man, you want to go to Up and Smoke tonight? I got an extra ticket, you know, and I had tickets to Spit Kicker. And I stand by that. Like, trust me, I didn't make a mistake, but I've still to this day never gotten to see Dre perform. I've seen M, I've seen Snoop, I've seen a lot of those guys. And, you know, you mentioned the VHS, the showmanship of lowriders on stage and dancers and all of that. But Spit Kicker was the exact opposite and just as dope. I mean, it was hardcore hip hop on the road. And, you know, I don't think any one label was behind it. I think, you know, Tommy Boy had, you know, was promoting some of it, and Ruckus was promoting some of it. And I remember, you know, Bismarck E, watching him DJ at that time was so eye-opening to me. I had turntables at home and was very infatuated, but to watch Biz, you know, he did this thing, you may have seen it, where he would cut a record back with his belly and like pull his shirt up, and just the showmanship of it all. And that was the first time I saw De La, which, you know, after Gangstar, De La is my favorite group. So to watch how these guys work the crowd in a really important year for them you know, one of the things we haven't talked about is they put out AOI, you know, the first of two, and that had Ooh on it with Redman, which, you know, come on, incredible record. But to see all of these folks together, that was still to this day one of the highest levels of emceeing. And I remember the Ruckus team that was there announced to the crowd when I went to that show in Pittsburgh that Big L's Big Picture had gone gold. And, you know, Big L had passed away at that point, knew who he was. I actually had his hip hop quotable from The Source cut out and taped on my wall from day one with DITC. And just to hear that, I remember just like being floored. It just definitely felt like the underground was on the highest level at that point.
Yeah, you know, you mentioned those two De La albums, man. Those two stand to me with, you know, any others in their catalog. I thought that was a resurgence for them that was incredible too.
Yeah.
You know, so we talked about Up in Smoke and Spit Kicker. The third really interesting tour was between two collectives, and two completely opposite sounding collectives. So Cash Money and Rough Riders. You want to break that one down?
Yeah, I mean, opposite sounding, but two movements that weren't, you know, big on samples. You look at Manny Fresh and you look at Swizz Beats and you know, the folks that were also in Rough Riders. I'm not talking about, you know, Dame Grease, who sampled heavily on DMX's first album, but, you know, Swizz, you know, was one of those guys like Rockwilder that came with and Pharrell, like a sound. He didn't need that. And the way that he was just programming up those beats. So to imagine that is really crazy to me. And to have artists from, you know, Yonkers, New York and the Bronx on one hand, and have folks from, you know, New Orleans together, it just felt like, you know, an incredible idea for artists that were certainly built to last. I didn't go to the tour. I don't even know if they came through Pittsburgh at the time, but I read a lot, and there's a lot of journalists that ask folks involved, and they say that that was one of those tours, sort of like, you know, the Hard Knock, you know, Life tour and different things, where just the fellowship was amazing. And let's not forget too, I mean, there were remixes. What was it? I think the Down Bottom remix that Juvenile had. Like, just those guys were working together, and it was a really cool time.
All right. So another thing is that you know, we've talked about this before. When hip hop first started, there was no underground because hip hop, by definition, was underground. And at some point, there became mainstream hip hop. You know, and listen, there were outliers even when all hip hop was underground. There was, like, you know, Young MC and Tone Loc and Vanilla Ice and MC Hammer. But these were people that, you know, kind of true hip hop scoffed at. And, you know, so they weren't really representing the culture. They were kind of like, they were selling out.
Yeah.
And so, but there was a time when there was a split, and hip hop became a true business that was supported by a big economic infrastructure, and, you know, was meant to be commercially viable on radio, and, like, you know, and bought in droves. But there was still an independent, you know, more, you know, I'd say pure, like not intended for radio vibe too, that was considered underground. Ninth Wonder had an interesting theory that we covered. He said it was the day that
Stakes is High.
yeah, it was written, and Stakes is High were released same day. And that was a schism between kind of mainstream and what then became underground. And Nas actually jumped from being underground to mainstream with a more polished album meant for more commercial play. I'm not sure if that was it, but I love that theory. But in any case, by 2000, the underground is firmly established. You have not only Raucous, which is kind of like the pinnacle of underground record labels, but you've also got pockets like Fat Beats, where the underground lives in a physical space and people can go and buy records and meet artists and hear and watch ciphers and like really experience it live and direct. And you say that 2000 was a benchmark year in the underground. Why?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few reasons, and one is, you know, I feel like after Eminem and Mos Def, two very successful artists, one platinum and one gold, had come in the late '90s, really the year before, with Slim Shady LP and then Black Star and Black on Both Sides. Every label, followed suit and tried to upstream artists that they thought were on that level. And while we may have never seen some of the commercial outcomes, I guess when you look at Black Eyed Peas, which were signed a couple years earlier, you may have gotten that. But hip hop benefited, and some of these labels, because at the time, I remember being a consumer and thinking, well, where is my money going? Does Def Jam need my money? But Ruckus or Fat Beats or Stones Throw might. And I look at that and I say, well, Dilated Peoples were signed by Capitol. Jurassic 5 and later Planet Asia were signed by Interscope. Rod Digga goes to Busta and Elektra. Royce was bouncing around, Tommy Boy and Sony System. Exhibit goes from this artist that was, very much, messing around with like King T and the Alcoholics to becoming Dr. Dre's next protege. Also, which I thought was really, really interesting and no one saw coming. All of these different folks were getting picked up. And then you started to have a real place to fit in for veterans. You mentioned Freddie Fox, Bumpy Knuckles, who had spent part of the '90s on Flavor Unit, put his first album out on MCA in '89, but he comes into this community and makes sense of it all. M.O.P. comes back, Cellar Dwellers, on and on and on. You started to see people just make completely authentic art, not be accountable to what my numbers are going to do, and have it work. So I think that's certainly an aspect of it. Another one is songs about hip hop itself are winning. I know we make fun of that these days, of like everything should be more about than just rapping about rapping. But to turn on the TV and see a video like The Sixth Sense by Common, which is about hip hop, but it's also about other things, that's crazy to me. We mentioned Dead Prez, Jurassic 5 with Quality Control, which was a big record. I mean, there's so many cases of this where there was a market and there was an interest, and most importantly, there were artists that didn't have to be deep, but could make a moving song about this thing I love, and people were buying it. They were buying it on album, they were buying it on vinyl. There was, you talked about Fat Beats being a place to buy. I remember growing up in Pittsburgh, being able to go to Sandbox Automatic online or undergroundhiphop.com, and you could buy this stuff and have it shipped through the mail to you. And I just think it was a really, really interesting nexus of underground versus mainstream. And when you look at what Bad Boy was doing with Shine and Black Rob, or just some of the decisions that the labels were making to try to compete, it kind of worked. It cut through the entire culture. Everybody wanted beats, rhymes, and skills.
It's funny because when I think about it, I had stayed on that mainstream wave right around until 2000, right? End of 99, beginning of 2000, that the underground started to really kind of pop up on my radar. And it was from Fat Beats. I lived like literally 2 blocks down the street from Fat Beats. And, it's when I, started like, going there and checking out vinyl. But the thing that really got me into it was Napster. The original Napster was really starting to like take off in 2000. And it was an absolute game changer because, up until then, the way you got your music was you went to the record store and you bought your CDs, or, if you lived in a big city, you could go to a vinyl store and buy singles and get, stuff that was kind of fresh. Or, you know, if you lived in New York or someplace like that, you could go and get mixtapes on the street from, DJs, Ron G and like Kid Capri and, Doo Wop, people like that. So Napster, though, was the great equalizer in that everyone in the world could have the entire universe of music at their fingertips. And it was not just like songs that were out on albums, it was rare remixes, it was blends, it was concerts, it was anything that had ever been recorded. And it was a complete paradigm shift. It would take you like 5 minutes to download a song, and an
Yeah.
album might take you all night because most people didn't even have broadband connections at that point.
Right.
But it was worth it because you could have whatever you wanted, and it was a complete paradigm shift. It also made it so that people didn't have to buy entire albums because you were locked into at that point. Once, if you liked a song, you had to buy the entire CD, and so like it was the beginning of the complete music revolution that is now like inhabited by Spotify and Apple Music and all these other Tidal and all these other platforms. But Napster was the thing, and I think it did a lot of things. Not only did it shift how music was consumed in the business of music, it broadened a lot of people's taste because you could experiment. You heard about the Grateful Dead. Okay, cool. I'm gonna download this. You heard about like this, about Fela Kuti. You can download that. Like, I mean, so people could, really experiment with things. I remember hearing the Wild and Peaceful remix of by Incognito by Kenny Dope Gonzalez.
Oh wow.
That like was to the that it was to the electric relaxation sample.
Oh shit. Okay.
It was incredible, and that's where I first heard like Critical by was it not? It's not Planet Asia. Man, I'm blanking on it. But like,
Zion I.
Zion, yeah, but
There you
by
go.
Zion, thank you. Featuring Planet Asia.
Yeah. Word.
And so that got me into Zion I, and and I can't find Zion I at Tower Records, so I go to Fat Beats and find it, and so much like stuff from the underground started to really pop for me. But it also, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I think it also signaled the end of crate digging
Mm.
because it used to be that I would be out in a club and I'd hear like a song, and like scour the earth trying to find it,
Yeah.
and like Distortion of Static, when I first heard that, it wasn't available for like 4 months after the video dropped. And you no longer had to go searching for things and dig in the crates for music because you could just type it in and it would be on your computer within 5 minutes or a couple hours at most. And so I think that Napster was like the beginning of a beautiful movement in music where everyone had everything at their fingertips, but also the beginning of the end of like what was ritual and like real culture and like a community, like so it was a very complex moment.
That's a good point. I remember when I was in high school, I had 1,000 CDs like by artists, and I remember putting them on display, and all I wanted to do was just show that to my friends, like they would give a fuck, and it was alphabetized, and I was just studying everything I had. And then all of a sudden, I mean, I remember people having CD books, and right around this time, those CD books started to change to CDRs with handwriting on them. And there were kids in my high school that would just sell compilations that they had downloaded and made of, stuff on there. And yeah, the game definitely did change. And for me, on one hand, I was really happy about it because everyone was taking their CD collection and trading them in, and then I would go buy it. But it lost a little bit of the luster. And it's as an aside, it's dope that you mentioned Zion I too, because there's a lot of groups and underground artists today that are very much around and successful that emerged out of this year and this time. And I just, not to go back to the underground, but to mention Cali Agents, you just said Planet Asia, Quasimodo. I mean, a huge year for Madlib, putting out The Unseen. Aesop Rock is very much around on a second album. Philly, Jedi Mind Tricks, Binary Star, Murs, who is somebody we cover a lot on AFH, Necro. There's so many artists that came out of this era because there was a community, and that community was definitely challenged by Napster. I never had it. I had LimeWire later, but I just remember, and I think Big L was a great example of that. I remember there were kids that I knew that had never read a source, had no clue what DITC was, but we're talking about this guy, Big L, and the Deadly Combination freestyle that, they put on his album that had him, Tupac, and Big, which was just, kind of tethered together freestyles. And I remember being frustrated just because I was like, how hard I had to work to find Big L, and literally you got people that are clicking, go eat a sandwich, come back, and they got the song. But AO technology.
Yeah, man.
So
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. No, I mean, one of the other things,
like 10 years later, that you could replicate what the original Napster had, like with all the remixes and live stuff, and that was YouTube.
right?
That's the only place you can find that repository.
That's a really good point. Just one of the other points that I wanted to make of year 2000. I know we bounced around a little bit, but I don't know that you're going to find another year in hip hop where all of the great producers are winning at the same time. You and I have spent time on this podcast talking about Dilla, mentioning Alchemist. You introduced the point of the Neptunes, but everybody, I don't care who your GOAT is. If it's DJ Premier, you've got Big L, you've got Bump, you've got Common, D'Angelo. If it's Dr. Dre, you've got this iconic Eminem album that we're talking about, plus Exhibit, plus Snoop. Everybody was working. And I mean, for you, do you think that is especially true of year 2000, or do you think it's just a damn good year for music, and of course the people providing it are going to be the GOATs?
No, I think this is a point that you pointed out. And when I started doing the research, I absolutely agreed. You had Pete Rock, who was producer for Slum Village and Big L, and also on that Raw and Bumpy Knuckles and Fife. You had Timbaland, who had the Romeo Must Die soundtrack. So he had Aaliyah and Genuine, and then he worked with Jay and Snoop and the Locks. The Neptunes were really just starting to make their run.
Yeah.
They had the incredible song with Beanie Man and Mystical, as you mentioned. Guru had a lot of superstar producers on his project, and they had Luther and Jay. RZA obviously was doing his thing. Manny Fresh. DJ Quick was still killing it with Balance and Options and Exhibit and AMG, and he had Mossberg. You mentioned Alchemist earlier with Dilated. He was just starting to get his start with Prodigy and Bumpy Knuckles. Yeah. And Dilla, Dilla just was everywhere. And then Kanye and Just Blaze too were just beginning their epic run. So man, it was an insane year for producers.
All over. And yeah, I mean, we had different sounds. Not everyone was sampling. You had your Mannies and your Timbos and guys that weren't. And yeah, I mean, I look at that and even like Large Professor, was doing some things and even putting out singles. And Prince Paul went and worked with Deltron, like Goes Out West. Del puts out another, you mentioned the Underground, dope project. So, I mean, even Marley, we didn't mention Marley Marl was working with Screwball. So I don't know, short of Larry Smith, if who your GOAT is, they're working with somebody and they're making it great. And I just think that that's super cool. And, with that said too, you and I often talk about the geography of hip hop. Say what you will, but the Midwest is stepping up. On one hand, you got Nelly right here, you got Jay Dilla, and then you've got Kanye making his inroads. In the South, I mean, this is a breakthrough year for Ludacris. He had kind of put out a project independently and then signs by way of Scarface to Def Jam, puts out Back for the First Time. That's a game changer. 3 6 Mafia had gone from, kind of putting out these indie projects to, beginning what I think is the ushering in towards the Oscar in the middle of the decade. And, they had Sipping on Some Scissorp. Right after Jay-Z had put out Big Pimpin' at the very end of '99. So by virtue of both of those songs, you got UGK again doing the same thing as 3 6 and really coming to collect their props. Trina, there's a whole bunch of other artists, and we mentioned it, but it was a breakthrough year for Beanie Sigel, Ja Rule on the East Coast. And yeah, I mean, on the West, I never know what to say of Alchemist or Exhibit, because Alchemist, lived for quite a while around this time in New York. but he's a, he's an LA Beverly Hills guy. Breakthrough year for him, and Exhibit, had bounced all around from Michigan to New Mexico to LA. And, even though X to the Z had put out previous albums, 2000 was, the year that ultimately kind of takes him to Pimp My Ride, Training Day, household name Exhibit. So it's all relative.
Yeah, and so you talk about the new stars. It was also a great run for some familiar faces. That it kind of, um, I won't say fallen off, but had definitely kind of had had descended a bit from their peaks. So you had Everlast from House of Pain, completely redefining himself. With Whitey Ford sings the blues, and the amazing songs on that album.
Plus the
Uh,
Santana look, which was album of the year that year,
yeah,
or would win it.
absolutely. And we talked about Bumpy Knuckles, aka Freddie Fox, reinventing himself. De La Soul, those two albums. We've talked about how rare it is for artists to put out two albums in a year, especially two good albums. It's commonplace now with Griselda and Currency and people like that. But like back then, when artists had true cycles where you didn't put out more than one a year, for them to do that was at that kind of quality was a fantastic thing. I know you mentioned UGK already, and
Cypress Hill too. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
so, and we talked about Eminem on the Rockstar mix. When I think of Training Day, I think of two songs, and that to me is one of the best movies. I know that came out, I believe, in '99. But when they jump in the car to Still Dre, but also when you hear Rock Superstar by Cypress Hill, I mean, and that's later in the movie when it's starting to get like, oh man. And I mean, shout out to Cypress. They were always active, but came back, a decade just about after their debut, and totally different sound, but it was still true to who they were. And that's a great record that just shows the talent in that group. And I loved seeing that. I just felt like age didn't matter as much at that point. Quick with Balance and Options, which is my favorite Quick album. Just so much good. And it was a great time to be watching Rap City every day. It was a great time to listen to Mix Show. Late at night, just on air, you could catch OutKast, all artists that might be 19 years old and artists that might be 35 years old. And the folks that really put in the work in the year 2000, the proof's in the pudding, because I think they're very much around today.
yeah, man. So you sold me. 2000 had it all. It had classic albums, iconic songs that have endured, beginnings of movements and careers for incredible artists and ends for others. Great tours. The underground like had its kind of like its coming out party.
Yeah.
Technological shifts with Napster, and producers, galore, new stars. Dude, it was an incredible year. An incredible year.
And the computers didn't crash. Y2K was all a myth, but all that we had left was some really dope hip hop, in my opinion. So why don't we close on what's your favorite song from year 2000, or what's your song of the moment? And I'll go first, and I'll go with 6th Sense by Common, just because we've talked about Com's album on here, and again, he went and he did the 199 with Sadat, and he had started to head in this direction. But when he came with that joint, that still to this day is one of my 5 favorite marriages of a message and a dope beat. And man, that song and video was just everything to me. But what's yours from the year 2000?
Man, it's so many. I'm actually gonna go with 2. So I sent you one earlier. Streets is Talking, Jay and Beanie Sigel.
Yeah.
And that beat was just incredible. But the other one you reminded me of today is Lay Low.
Oh wow.
That joint, I love that joint. The Snoop and Nate Dogg joint, so good, man. So yeah, man, 2000 was a great one.
Absolutely. Well, let us know what you think. Let us know what you remember of it. Let us know where you're where you definitely disagree with us, and This is not the end of the series. So if you think that we're overlooking a year, just you wait.
Absolutely. All right, man.
All right, man.
Time.
Till next time. Peace.
Yeah.